Board Games. I'm Thomas, and this week we're going to talk through 7 things that I hope to see in 11th edition. So, as some of you may know, Warhammer 40,000 typically runs on about a 3-year release cycle, or at least it has in the past. There's been a couple exceptions, but for the most part, every 3 years, we're introduced, you could say, to a new edition of Warhammer 40,000. And 10th edition has been around for just a little bit over 2 years now. So the rumor, technically, is that June of next year, 2026, we will see 11th edition of Warhammer 40,000. And, you know, I've just been on a little bit of a game design kick, checking out some other tabletop war games as well. And I thought it'd be kind of a fun thought experiment, especially since we had the reveal show not too long ago, to talk about maybe what we might see with this new edition of Warhammer 40,000. So I do have kind of 2 different categories, but kind of 7 things I hope for total, but also a few things that I really hope we don't see, but we'll talk about each of them. So the first kind of section are possible changes. So these are the changes that I actually think are going to happen and what we're probably going to see come 11th edition. So firstly, I think they're going to fully revamp Combat Patrol. The boxes are great monetary value for a lot of the armies. I definitely think there's a few of them that I probably wouldn't have gotten for my army regardless of it being a better deal, just because I don't know if I'm going to enjoy the kits that are within it. Honestly, for all 3 of my armies, I didn't get the Combat Patrol for them. I think if I were to go back in time, I would decide to get the Tyranids one, just because the Psychophage got the massive facelift that it did. Termagants are fine. The Winged Tyranid Prime would be pretty cool to have leading some warriors. And I do like the Von Ryan's Leapers. Barbgaunts, take them or leave them. They actually are decent. You know, they can add movement and stuff, which is nice, but 5-man squad is not the best in terms of output and that sort of thing. So I also didn't get the Tau one. I'm not a big fan of the Devilfish. It might have been a decent value, but I also already have all the commanders I think I will need. So just one of those things where I think, as it stands right now, Combat Patrol in 40,000 is just to get the discount. Not a lot of people, at least in my local area, if it's different for you all, please let me know. But not many people play Combat Patrol. It just doesn't really seem like a viable format, I guess. A lot of people kind of complain that it kind of shows you how to build your models. You have to build your models in a certain way, but then that's not the optimal way to do it for 40K. So it's kind of like it leads you to think that these would be the optimal builds, but they aren't. And to my knowledge, they all are playable within 40,000. I don't think any of them are built in a way that makes them unplayable in 40K. But the issue with having sort of predefined loadouts is if something were to happen with the rules in the future, it could potentially make that unit unplayable because of the assembly. Granted, I mean, that's only if your shop or your tournament is really WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get kind of thing. So kind of take that maybe with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I think that Combat Patrol in 11th edition is going to look a lot more like Spearhead does for AOS, because Spearhead has grown in popularity. It's gotten more people into Age of Sigmar because you buy, you know, the $160 box set of miniatures. They're all actually pretty favorable miniatures, it seems like. Like most of the units that are within them are ones that you'll want to have in the army itself. So it's a good box, it's a good value, and the gameplay of Spearhead is actually very solid and actually seems like it would be a lot of fun. A lot of people really go and, you know, they lush and gush over it, saying that it's one of the better, smaller format kind of games that Games Workshop creates. So I think we're going to see Combat Patrol look a lot more like Age of Sigmar. We already kind of saw that a little bit with the catch-up mechanic with the Challenger cards. AOS already has something similar to that, where the person that is the underdog gets a little bit of a benefit, and then you take a disadvantage if you were to take a double turn during Spearhead, because you roll off every turn to just see whose turn it is. So there's a few things that I think have kind of found their way into the chapter approved decks for 2025, 2026. So I think that it's reasonable to think that we're going in that direction. We've also seen quite a few combat patrols not only get new skins on them, but also new ones being released that look pretty different from what we're kind of used to. So I think there is going to be a pivot in combat patrol for 11th edition. I think the next thing, and I think this will be a good change, is going to be in terrain. I think we're going to see quite the overhaul of the terrain rules. I think that right now we're kind of doing the best that we can with what we have. I think it kind of shows its face a little bit with when you're looking at the tournament companion kind of terrain layouts. It's only ruins, everything's ruins and L-shaped walls, which, I'm not necessarily against completely. But unfortunately, the terrain rules kind of make it so that's the most viable form of terrain is ruins, because most units can move through it. It provides line of sight blocking, and then with the terrain footprints that they use, it's just further line of sight blocking, further cover, and that sort of thing. Makes it harder for melee type armies to be shot off the table by shooting armies. I think it leans kind of one direction or the other. There's definitely some of them where melee has a very hefty advantage, and then there's others where I think shooting armies are completely fine and that sort of thing. So while I think having terrain layouts, and of course that's only for tournament play. When you're in your shops, you obviously don't have to use those, but I've kind of found that, at least in my kind of environment, my community, we tend to lean towards those if we want kind of a balanced game. Personally, while I did kind of prefer those while I was sort of learning to play, I've kind of found more of a heart for kind of making interesting or fun tables, kind of talking with my opponent on like, okay, what is a building, what's going to be the footprint, and that sort of thing. I do have the terrain layouts, and I do have like the fancy objective markers and stuff, just because I think they make the game a little bit smoother to play. I also recently put in orders for Awakened Wildwoods and the Citadel Wood set, that's on, sort of the made to order right now, just to give myself, my personal collection, a little bit of an uplift, but also have something that I can take to the shop to add to the tables, and have some fun there. And just as a reminder, I actually do play at a Games Workshop store. For me, it's just the best kind of community in my area, at least as far as I've found right now. I really enjoy playing with the guys there, and it's been a really great community experience and that sort of thing. The store owner is fantastic, so I have more reasons to stay than to leave, is basically what I'm saying. But all that being said, I do think that terrain is going to be something that is updated in Warhammer's 11th edition. I think they made some improvements in 10th, but I think that some of the community backlash is kind of yearning for some more variety in the terrain, because the true nature of it is when you have a game that has a competitive side to it, everyone is going to lean on that being the standard, right? If you say that the tournament standard is footprints, L-shaped walls, C-shaped walls, then when you go to a random shop to play, the kind of expected experience for most players there are going to be the tournament kind of thing. And of course, like, we have a lot of creators and a lot of tournament organizers that kind of push against the grain and make more narrative tables, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But even in other games, you find that when you're looking at, it kind of puts the brackets around, right? So in reality, with Warhammer 40,000, you could have a game with no terrain. I don't recommend it, but you could. Or you could have a table that is so like condensed, like dense with terrain, that vehicles can like barely make their way through, and the infantry are able to get through. But if you maybe, instead of using ruins, you use actual buildings, they can't go through the walls, so everyone's having to go through the streets and that sort of thing, and it becomes this sort of gridiron of very tactical combat of figuring out, okay, when do I peek out, when do I not, and that sort of thing. And that's not really something that's spoken about in the rules necessarily. Of course, there's like bordering actions, and Kill Team have similar kind of things, but like when we're talking about the scale of 40k, the war game of 40k, it's just not there. And when you think 40k, you kind of think of ruins, L-shaped ruins, and the tournament layouts, because they're literally baked into the app. Like when you look up terrain layouts, you find these tournament approved ones that are balanced. I definitely, you can't really argue that they are not balanced, but if you think about it and you look at the terrain format, it doesn't look like any city that you could imagine, right? There's these weird like radial symmetrical walkways and buildings, and like why would there be like this weird shaped building here? And are we looking at it like this entire table was just like one massive superstructure that is like caved in, and like there's now these open freeways that we can go through? It's just kind of a weird sort of thing. And I think we'll talk about a little bit of narrative gaming here in a second with my personal wish list, but I feel like we could find a better balance of, maybe it is just sort of more of a distinction of like, this is tournament play and shouldn't be the expected, and then this is everything else, and this is the rules of the game, and this is like how it works. And another thing that I've run into a lot is the rules of terrain. I feel like while there are core rules available, I think everyone kind of has their own understanding of them, and own expectations of it. So in some cases I'll play and it's like the tournament is the size that it is, so if you can see over it, you can shoot them if you can see them, kind of thing. Kind of what I would honestly consider the core rules, which is like if you can see it, you can shoot it, and obstructions cause cover, and that sort of thing. And of course the footprint allows for benefit of cover as well. But then, I get into some where it's like actually, ruins are like infinitely tall. So if it's behind a wall, it's behind a wall, that sort of thing. And that's fine too. I mean, it allows for a little bit more maneuverability, makes shooting armies a little bit less strong. I mean, with Tau at least, we have a few things that can shoot almost all the way across the table. So being able to just see something that happens to be peeking out over the top of a building from across the table without any moves is a little rough. But, it's just one of those things where kind of have to, it's like a weird kind of rule zero conversation where it's like, okay, are walls? Do windows and doors count? Are we able to see and shoot through? Or are they true line of sight blocking? Are ruins infinitely tall? A lot of stuff kind of getting into a conversation before we get started, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I think that it's good to make sure that you're on the same page before you get into the game, and then it's like, hey, that's not how I understand that to work. Can you like show me where that is the rule? And in truth, most of the time they're not able to, and they're just like, oh, well, this is how we always play. And I'm kind of like, well, this is how the rules work. So if I had understood that was how you were playing it, I might not have moved there. And then we get into this weird, like, sometimes your opponent is courteous and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. We can either play your way, or, if we want to continue playing my way, I'll let you take this move back, that sort of thing. Or you have someone that isn't so, and it's like they try and be more of a, well, it's not my fault that you don't know the rules work this way. And so I'm sorry, but I'm going to pick up that unit now because you moved even though I'm playing by different rules than you, which isn't the way to be, I don't think. I think it's better just to have the conversation beforehand is ultimately what I'm saying. But I think that there could be maybe a push toward, I don't know if simpler is the right way. I think some of the terrain rules are a little complicated. I'd like to see some streamlining there that makes it more of a, this is what happens when X thing exists. instead of it being like, well, when a vehicle's towed in, it can't shoot through, but people can shoot it, and then it can only shoot out the sides that it's on. But if a vehicle is fully within, it can shoot out of any direction, whatever. And then if it's towed off the other side, it can't shoot behind itself. It's just like, it makes sense, like in a little bit of like streamline of consciousness. Like, okay, yeah, I mean, if like there's a little bit of vehicle showing, but it's also like, if the part of the vehicle that has the gun on it is in the terrain, wouldn't it be able to shoot through the terrain? And maybe that's a whole other thing where you get into bringing back facings of vehicles and all that jazz. But I don't know. I think terrain is something that needs to be updated, and I definitely think that it's something to be updated in the 11th edition, because I think that Games Workshop sees kind of the frustration from the fan base. And then the last kind of possible change, like what I actually think will happen, is war gear having points. But I don't think it's going to be what it used to, where it's like, you know, giving one guy in a squad a las pistol is 10 points and one guy a bolter is 5 points, and that sort of thing, where it's like nitpicky every single model. But I do think what they're going to do is have additional war gear options for squads. So squads will have like their standard loadout, and then it'll be, if you want to add this thing or this thing, it is 5, 10, 15 points. And it not be like a per model thing. It's like the unit. Like right now, for example, you're able to say like, okay, in this unit of 10, for every 5 models, you're able to replace one model with a las cannon. I think what they might do is basically in that scenario, it's saying if you do replace a model with a las cannon, it's 5 points. So it's not like a per model thing. It's like the unit can add this specialty weapon for additional points. And I think the reason I think that they would do that is the amount of times I go into a game where we're playing 2,000 points and I'm at like 1995 or 1990 or even like 1980, but I've already used my 3 enhancements. It's like there's a lot of times where you're within that like 10 to 15 point range. I think when you get into 20 points higher or lower, that's like the safe zone of like, these are still probably pretty matched armies if we're about 20 points apart. Any more than that, I think you're looking at potentially bringing in an HQ to be able to swing it the other way, so that way you're even closer. But I think they're going to tweak it in some way that would allow a little bit more customization for a unit per unit basis, just to make up some of those differences of those, 10, 15, or even 20 point differences from the actual gaming size total. And I think it could also work in the opposing way, where, right now, you can have a squad that has, 2 las cannons, and it costs the same as if you didn't take the las cannons. But maybe now the unit with las cannons is priced at its current price, but instead it starts as like the typical loadout at like 20 points minus, but then it's like for every las cannon add 10 points, something along those lines. I don't know if I have enough of the like granular knowledge to know, one las cannon should be 10 points. I don't know if it's that minute, but I think we're going to see something along those lines where, because I do find, talking with more of the veterans of the hobby, that they miss that level of like granularity. But I also find with newer players, they're thankful that there isn't that much granularity, because they like being able to just like, get on the app, type everything in, and then you have your, 1,000 point, 2,000 point, whatever list. And it's like everything's there, everything's loaded out, and it's not like a plus or minus messing with the points totals. It's just like, okay, I want this unit because it's 150 points. That's what I need, and I can have the best loadout possible. So yeah, I think there's going to be something that allows those like little tweaks in order to kind of have a little bit more customization, but also to make it so that armies can actually like be at the points totals, and you can actually tweak an army to a degree where when you're off by a handful of points, one of you is able to kind of adjust to meet the other without it being, okay, well, let me, swap this entire crisis suit squad for the Sun Forges because I need to make up, 20 points, or, swapping my Enforcer or my Cold Star commander to an Enforcer commander to drop by 15 points, that sort of thing. It's not changing actual units, it's instead changing some of their gear or adding something to it, like an ability or something that would kind of push or pull you from that points total. Just kind of what I think we might see. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but I think it would be a net positive because it would it'd just give you a little bit more customization over your army, but B, it's also allowing it to feel less like, oh, okay, well, I have exactly 2,000 points. My opponent is struggling at 1980. Golly, can't do math right now. But they could find like a couple of things to like buff up their, one or two units to meet me or get closer to there. And then it doesn't feel like at the end of it all, if he loses and he can be like, oh, well, you had 20 more points than I did, which honestly, that's never really been my experience, but I could see that being maybe an excuse or something. But also there's been plenty of times where I'm actually above in points and I've lost because, dice rolls or whatever. Also strategic planning on my own part. I'm still figuring out some of that, what's best to do in certain scenarios and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I think War Gear would probably be the next likely thing. So those are kind of my three possible changes, the changes that I think are most likely to happen. And next we'll kind of get into maybe my wish list, what I would like to see that maybe won't be a thing. And some of these are a little bit more abstract, honestly. But first up is narrative gameplay. I think the chapter approved decks gives a lot more to the narrative side of 40k. And obviously, I think there is already the distinction between kind of narrative play and competitive play. And, excuse me. Competitive play is, I think, the more spoken about thing. And more people talk about, okay, what's the meta, what's the balances, what's this, what's that, and that's completely fine. No issue with that whatsoever. I also look into, watch videos on tournament play as well, because I think it's fascinating to see kind of the balance of the game, what armies are doing better and why, and learning more about the design of the game that causes these things. And also kind of learning like, okay, well, what is a way that I can maybe push against the top armies and that sort of thing to be able to maybe challenge them if I were to be in a situation where I played them. And in so doing, it's, that's competitive play. But then you have narrative play, which I think is oddly what more of the like abilities and rules of 40k are actually designed for. For example, Tyranids, and we'll talk about a little bit more of this in a second, but Tyranids, a lot of their abilities revolve around Battle Shock, and Battle Shock in 40k is kind of like your fear. So like when you're afraid or battle shocked, it like affects you in some way. And I feel like that's a very narrative thing, like your units are literally getting scared or have been through some sort of traumatic thing, like a vehicle exploding around them, that they are now battle shocked. They're not able to do actions because the most they can do is defend themselves. They can't, they're at a disadvantage if they run away. They can't perform actions, and they can't hold objectives because they're so focused on, I'm battle shocked, like that sort of thing, right? It's a very narrative thing. And then you also have narrative like strength in armies, like Custodes and Grey Knights are very powerful, and part of that is because of the lore. It's part of the fantasy of the game that these units are meant to be elite warriors. And I think, weirdly enough, some things have actually fallen away from the narrativity. the narrative. That's it. I've fallen away from the narrative of sort of the lore and that sort of thing in Space Marines. Like now, Space Marines feels like borderline Horde Army, at least now in this stage of 10th edition. We don't know what 11th edition may bring in this regard. It might bring them back to feeling more elite, where you're not having to run so many units of Space Marines to field, an actual list to play. But, it's kind of a weird thing where some abilities are very heavily influenced by like the narrative of the army. And I feel like there's some things that we want to make more narrative. And with narrative gameplay, you're kind of able to do that. You can play these, asymmetrical battles where, you have fewer points value of X faction fighting to defend themselves against a larger point value of Y faction. It would be really interesting to kind of see this push for like other narrative game modes that are more enticing for creating a story. Whenever I play at the shop, or a lot of the other guys play at the shop, we're actually looking, we're talking with one another. It's like, oh, what are we doing here? Like, why are the Tau facing the World Eaters? Or why are the Tau defending against the Elder Demons? And it's like, there are also times where we'll do like 2v1s or 2v2s. And it's like, okay, why are Tau and World Eaters working together against like the Tyranids and the Orcs or something like that? And it's like, okay, well, maybe right now, the Orcs and the Tyranids are just ravaging the planet. And we're kind of here to try and slow them down a little bit, maybe try and force them out and that sort of thing. And then the Orcs are just there to fight, and the Tyranids are just there to eat the biomass. So they're just they're almost like a weird neutral party and all this. So it's just like this really fascinating kind of thing. But it would be kind of cool to see, like, okay, what if they did make sort of a narrative mission where it's like, all right, Team A, the defender, maybe starts with half their points, right? And they get to add in units as they go, or their, the rest of their team, the rest of their army is in reserves, and it's like they just come in waves. And then the attacker, maybe is a similar kind of thing where they can only, deploy from the back line and bring their people in. And it's sort of this feeling of these like unending waves, or even have it be that, maybe the attacker is actually able to replenish their models. Maybe they heal, or maybe when a model is destroyed, it gets a like 3 or 4 up resurrect kind of thing. And it's sort of like all the defender has to do is hold the line. And there could be like 3 objective markers within their deployment zone. And then there's like 2 for the attackers to kind of hold and keep, and that sort of thing. But then it's just lasting. You just have to last until the end. And if the defenders manage to win out and they're able to remain until the end of the game, they're able to be the victor. And I know that kind of goes against like some of the, I guess, the scoring philosophy of 40,000, where, it's mainly an objectives game, right? You're mainly going to be scoring the most points by holding objectives, doing the primary stuff, and then you get your secondary kind of missions where you're able to get supplemental points, but you're not going to, the game is kind of won with these objectives, and the person that can hold the more objectives longer is going to ultimately win, unless the opponent is able to keep up scoring with secondaries, which it can be argued that some armies are better at doing that than others. But also when you're playing, tactically, and you're having a draw every turn, you have no way to predict what's coming. So it's more of a long shot that you have a string of secondaries that you're able to perform both maximally and be able to match or exceed the points of your opponent that's just sitting on objectives. So that's kind of my thing, is like, I think narratively, and like I said before, the chapter proved like the asymmetric missions and even some of the other ones, I think really are sort of pushing towards that narrative gameplay that I think a lot of people really want. but I would love to see maybe an expansion into that. And one thing I think that would be really cool is if we take a note from Crusade and their agendas. So in Crusade, you are able to pick Crusade specific agendas or faction specific agendas from your faction's Crusade rules. And I think having those be an option to be implemented maybe more succinctly with typical games of 40k, and maybe be something that is a one-time points buff kind of deal. Tyranids liking to devour biomass, so maybe there's like a specific unit that is selected as your like biomass unit. Maybe the gene stealers really want the brain matter of this, or the lictors really want something from this, and so you devouring the biomass, defeating that unit, actually grants you victory points because it's your it's your faction's goal. The Tau, on the other hand, want to be able to meet with leaders or meet with dignitaries of wherever they are, or even possibly protect a dignitary and that sort of thing. So they may have either an extra objective marker added to the battlefield, and they get points for holding that objective throughout the game, or something along those lines. I think that could be a very fascinating, sort of more riveting way of being like, hey, in this game, like if you want to do more of a narrative thing, what if we do this where while Tau holds this objective, they just score an extra point. Make it so it's not, obviously it wouldn't be your home, and it wouldn't be the one closest to home, but maybe the center objective, or even your opponent's no man's land objective. That it's like, okay, if we hold this, we actually score an extra victory point. Something small is something that will have an effect on the game, but ultimately like isn't going to be game breaking, but would make it feel like you have something else to do, instead of just hold the objective, draw my 2 cards. Okay, I have to do double actions this turn, even though I'm really wanting to be able to shoot. And then for other armies as well, it's like it could be a fun way where it's like, get armies to do things that they would actually want to do based on kind of the lore, or even just have it be like an open face kind of agenda. And of course you can kind of do this maybe with choosing fixed objectives, like, and you can kind of thematically be like, oh, this is why I'm choosing established locus, and I don't have another one off the top of my head for some reason. There's like the other one where you have multiple table quarters, engage in all fronts. So you choose those 2, and it's just because like, oh, the Tau are we're establishing points to be able to bring in future reinforcements, but also like we're just trying to dominate and hold on all corners to flank around the enemy. And if we manage to hold out, we'll bring in the storm surges to be able to wipe out the rest of everything, right? So it's kind of like they're field controlling to kind of herd the enemy, so that way there's no chance of escape. And then when their true end game kind of lands, to be able to wipe them out, it's all said and done. Something along those lines. I think it could be kind of cool to like spark more of that sort of narrative play and make it more fun. And I also think that narrative play is going to lend people to want to change terrain more, make the table be more fitting for what they're trying to do, and have it be just an overall a more kind of immersive experience for both players. And I get it. Not everyone wants that. Not everyone wants, more of the narrative thing. There's probably more people, arguably, that want to keep 40k in the direction of going towards more tournament play and more balanced match play kind of thing. But there is a significant portion of the community that really wants narrative play. And I think the more kind of little things that we get in the bulk of 40k that can, advocate for that is ultimately going to be better. It's going to give more people entry into the format and be able to kind of enjoy the game that they want to play, because not everyone's a tournament grinder. Not everyone wants balanced games on fixed layouts, and having a balance of both, I think, is ultimately a good thing. kind of my next thing is more unique kits and units and data sheets. So basically, kits that build a single unit but have multiple build options. So one that comes to mind is the Aggressor's Kit for Space Marines. So with the Aggressor's Kit, you can make aggressors with Bulletstorm gauntlets and missile packs, or you can make Flamestorm gauntlets, which are flamers. So you have these one data sheet units that are two different builds in the same box. And I think what would be great to see is any of these kind of boxes actually be two separate data sheets. So that way, if you want, or if you really like Gravis armor, or just overall this style of the aggressors, you can actually run multiples of them and not be forced to kind of pick between them. And I also think, notably, when you have a unit that has, Bulletstorm kind of like rapid fire gauntlets and crack missiles on your back, having a unique ability for them versus having flame gauntlets where you're, shooting out a torrent of flames, and having a unique unit ability for them, you could have this interesting thing where it's kind of like, okay, well, the Bulletstorm maybe gets, maybe they keep that additional armor penetration if they're attacking the closest unit, because it's just like every bullet is going into them, but then maybe give the Flamestorm some kind of like battle shock kind of thing, or some other kind of disruption style ability that is conducive for that. Basically make it so that when you're building, it's not just choosing, okay, which weapon is best for this unit. It's choosing, okay, which unit is going to be better for my army and my playstyle. Because there's a little bit I kind of understand. So like I play salamanders, so it made sense that I built them as the Flamestorm gauntlets, because that's kind of the salamanders thing. And it may not be the best loadout. It may be the best loadout in certain cases, but I'm not choosing it because it's better. I'm choosing it because of the narrative reason behind it. And if I had it to where there are two separate data sheets, one, I could run both if I wanted to. And honestly, I think I probably would, because I really like that unit and that look of that unit. But if I, liked that the Bulletstorm's ability was better, or more what I want my army to be doing, I can choose them instead of the Flamers, because of a reason for what I want my army to be doing. And of course, with them specifically, it's not like a thing that affects other units as well, like causing battle shock or making movement slower or that sort of thing. They are literally just increasing AP against the closest unit. But it gives a little bit more freedom to be able to have those sorts of things where you can sort of make units be more unique by having them be two separate units. Separate the data sheets, make it so it's what they did with crisis suits. Like with crisis suits, you used to be able just to put whatever on whatever, and then that was the unit. So you were restricted to 3 battlesuit units on the field. But now that they separated them into 3 like subclasses, Sunforge, Sunforge, Starscythe, and Fire Knife, you now can have 3 of each of those, which makes it more viable to have a full army of battle suits. That I think is really cool, and it's more narrative focused. They are a pretty solid unit, and there's definitely ones that are better than others. But if I choose to run suboptimal units, that's on me. But ultimately, I'm playing the army that I want to play, whether regardless of how good it is against certain things. So I just think that giving that option and being able to make it so it's separate data sheets ultimately is going to allow for even more fun and more customization across everything. Do I think they're going to do it? Probably not, because that's adding a lot more. It's adding more to the app. It's adding a lot more to just everything in general. But it's something that I would like to see. And something that's not necessarily... My next thing is something that isn't really rules focused, but more of a community focus, would be the continuation of regular detachment supplements. So similar to Grotmas and these quarterly updates with the new detachments, I think it would be an amazing thing for the game if they continue doing this. Granted, we have seen some of these come off the page and be very strong. Think about Mordaka from the Orcs. It was pretty oppressive for the few weeks that it was kept at its original release kind of rulings until they nerfed it pretty much into oblivion, which is unfortunate that they overcorrected so hard, but they did what they felt they needed to in order to reestablish a balanced game state. So we can't really punish them for trying to do that, even though I think a lot of times there's a little bit too much of an overcorrection. But ultimately, why I like these things is that you basically know that, if you're indexed right now or at the beginning of the edition, which many of us will be, we're probably going to get the Big Bad and the Space Marines first off rip in terms of getting codexes for them. But most armies are going to start as an index army, which means you're just going to have the rules online that you'll be able to use and play until your codex get released. And if you're one of the armies right now that still doesn't have a codex, you're still able to use your index rules. But in editions past, you would only have the single detachment that was released with your index. So for the entire 3 years of the edition, you're playing the same army the same way the entire time. But what these, seasonal releases would allow for is for you to at least have 2, maybe even 3 more ways to play before you get your codex. Or when you get your codex, you'll obviously get your extra ones there, which I do, if they go this way, maybe it'd be an opportunity to have fewer detachments. But I like the idea that most, if not all codexes, would have 5 or more detachments within them. So that way you have 5 direct ways to play out of there. And then you get, the 2 or 3 extra ones from either quarterly release or Grotmas or whatever they do during the edition. But that way, if you're an early codex army like Space Marines, and you're not, branching out into the supplemental chapters, you have your, 5 or 6 at launch or once the codex drops. But throughout the edition, you still get your 2 or 3 more. So by the end of the edition, in that last year, you have, 6, maybe 7 kind of detachments to choose from. That gives you this opportunity that maybe, if you're really into one army, so like I'm really into Tau, for example, I really like battle suits. I pretty much only play Retaliation Cadre or Experimental Weapon Cadre, and I've been toying a little bit with Cao Yan, but if I had, maybe another sub-faction that implemented more of the infantry, I might actually want to get like Breachers or Fire Teams, Pathfinders, and that sort of thing, and maybe push into a little bit of that. I'm not the biggest fan of Kroot. I know we have the Kroot detachment, dedicated detachment, as well as the Grotmas, as well as the Grotmas kind of auxiliary cadre, where it's it's better at mixing all the different alien species that are within the Tau force. But it kind of would give us the ability to kind of evolve over time, maybe branches into new models that we wouldn't have thought of before, and that sort of thing. I just think ultimately it's a good thing to do. I think it shows that designers are working to make a better game state for everyone involved. And when they see that an army isn't getting played as much, they can kind of push some excitement into them by releasing rules to play them differently. So I hope that in 11th edition we see the continuation of these extra detachments over the course of the edition. And I hope that it starts earlier, that it is sort of a at launch, we see, everyone gets a detachment within the first year, in addition to whatever detachments they may have had through Codex or Index, and then maybe every year during the edition they get an extra one, something along those lines. I think that would be something I would really like to see. And then last, kind of on my wish list here, this is actually something I think would be cool that they would actually add, but I don't see enough of it that I think that it's going to happen. So Battle Shock. I mentioned it a little bit before with the Tyranids, but I think that Battle Shock needs to be more impactful. Um, it either needs to be more impactful, or the abilities that affect it more, that it's more of a chance that it happens. Because basically, most of the Imperium and most of Chaos, especially if they are Space Marines of either side, have such a high leadership value that they will never be battle shocked, even at -1, and sometimes even at -2, which is something the Tyranids can do. But if the whole army's kind of thing is trying to get you battle shocked, so they get an advantage that makes them supposed to be on par with other armies, having it be such an impossibility for battle shock to happen makes it almost unreasonable to run like cool units that do that thing. And it's kind of like, think about it this way: Tyranids, right? From a lore perspective, they are meant to be so scary. Whereas right now, it's kind of like Tyranids are scary, so they should have a chance to battle shock some enemies. Instead, Tyranids are an existential threat that should battle shock most enemies. And then if you make it so that battle shock matters more, because I mean, I think there's definitely been times in my experience that battle shock has affected my army. But also, I play Tau. Our leadership is 8 up or 7 up. It's above the average. That when I roll my, save, my battle shock test, I will fail if I have minuses on it, because it's just naturally balanced to go that way. Whereas many, Space Marines or kind of other equivalents, theirs is lower, 5, 6, something along those lines, where they're almost still guaranteed to roll average of 7, plus or minus 1, regardless of the abilities that debuff it. And for it, now I will say that you can't hold objectives while Battle Shock is good. Making it so you can't do objectives is good. I think what Battle Shock affects right now is fine, but I think I would like to see it either affect more, or just in general be an easier thing to have done, because as it stands now, I just don't think it's as impactful enough across the board, unless you're in an army that just naturally isn't good at battle shock, like the Tau. And I know it may come across as me being like, oh, I want Tau to be better at battle shock. No, I don't want them to be better at battle shock. It completely makes sense that they are not good at battle shock because of their way of life, their kind of ideology. It makes sense that they are not passing battle shock all the time. I don't want our lives to be easier. I want it to feel like battle shock matters across the board. That way, whenever I do eliminate, half a unit of Space Marines, I actually think like, oh, they could get battle shock. Like, it could happen. And that be an actual concern, because as it stands right now, there's not really as much a concern of having units at half strength. It really is, and part of it is the lethality of 10th edition. That is kind of like, okay, if my unit survives, great. The reality is that they're most likely not going to survive if I put them out in an open area, and that sort of thing. Like, units just going to be picked up. It's become such a game of, put the right unit near the unit they can lift off the table, and then, initiate that plan of lifting that unit off the table, which can be good, can be bad. I think there's plenty of discussions around that. But I would like to see battle shock just be something that actually feels like it matters more, because if you're in an army that can fail it pretty easily, you are genuinely worried about that. And I like that feeling of, oh no, like, I'm going to have to make a battle shock test and I'm not confident that my team is going to be able to do it. Whereas if you're a Space Marine player, you're more like, oh, okay, battle shock, whatever. Like, if I fail it, I'm just going to get mad that my dice didn't roll well. But I have such a high chance of getting it passed, it doesn't really matter. So that's kind of, those are like my 7 hopes for 40k. The combat patrol, terrain, and war gear updates that I think are possible, and then my narrative, more unique kits, regular detachment supplements, and battle shock being ones that I would hope to happen. But I did also want to add in a few extra ones of what I really hope doesn't happen in 11th edition. Sorry, I got on the 7s there for a sec. What I don't want to see is in relation to a thing that I think is going to happen with war gear. War gear, I think, I don't want it to be a per model basis and be that every model, it matters what each model carries. And, as you're building a unit of like 10 people, it can go from like 50 to 120 points based on what you choose there. I don't want that level of granularity. It's not terrible right now if I have to like quickly run up a list to be able to play, a random number of points with an opponent. At my shop, we have a lot of newer people, myself included, but they're like, hey, I have like 1,700 points. Can we play? I'd like to use all my models. And I'm like, yeah, sure. And I'll just like write up a 1,700 point list, or, make a 1,700 point list that I can use in the future as well. That makes sense for, that sort of thing. But being able to like relatively on the fly, it might take 5, maybe 10 minutes just to throw a list of like a weird quantity together to be able to play them. I enjoy doing that. I want to be able to do that for newer players. I like playing the in-betweens as well, just because, it is a pretty big jump from 1,000 to 2,000, and I want that to be as easy as possible. But if we have these costed war gears where it's like each individual change is going to tweak it to a point where it's very difficult to play, and be able to like, oh, hold on, let me take out this las cannon, let me give this guy a bolter, let me do this, do that. And then it's like, okay, you said how many points again? 1,800. And then I feel like we might get into the weeds a bit more, where it's like right now most people are like 500, 1,000, 1,500, maybe 1,700, and then 2,000. But I feel like if we get into those really picky granularity, it's going to be a feeling of like, okay, well now we need to be within like 5 to 10 points of each other, because it is allowed, like there's more room to be able to manage and be closer. Whereas I think right now, being about 20 points apart isn't terrible. Any more than that, you definitely want to be looking at, okay, well, can you add an enhancement, or take an enhancement away, so that way we can be on the same page and that sort of deal. So I don't want super granular war gear cost, even though I like some level of granularity. I think that would be just a step too far and would end up pushing out a lot of newer players. Number 2 is I really hope it's not a full rules revamp. So like if they completely turn 10th edition on its head, I think it would be arguably the downfall of the success that 10th edition was. And of course, it's not just the game that we have to attribute to that. We had Space Marine 2 release, we had the special on Amazon release, and all that hype, getting people kind of thinking about 40k more, putting it into the lap of pop culture media, has brought a ton of people into the hobby, and we can also track that with sales from GW and that sort of thing. So if they were to do a full game, like a full revamp of the rules, I don't know if the majority of those newer players that came into the hobby coming from these outside sources will be committed enough to learn the full rule set all over again. And I think that it would be better if we kind of, because I think 10th edition is good. I think it can definitely be better, as many things can be. So I think doing more of a 10.5, where we can kind of keep maybe even some of the current codexes or detachments available into 11th edition, is going to make the transition to a new edition better. And ultimately, if you have 10 things that make a game system and you're going to move to the next edition, you don't change all 10 things. You might change 5, but it would probably be better to be a little bit less than that. Make 3 of those things better, keep the other 7 about the same, obviously tweaking what needs to based on the other 3 being changed, but then run with that for a little while. Okay, what does that feel like? And then once you kind of establish, okay, of the 3 things we changed, 2 of those were really good. One of them was really, really, really bad. So we're going to change that back to 10th edition. But now we're going to pick for 12th edition, we're going to pick another 3 things to change that, maybe it's, this time it's like terrain and stuff. Like people don't really like how terrain works. That's one of the 3 things. We changed that. Hooray, we did it right. That doesn't get touched for a while until it becomes a bigger issue. But now that terrain's fixed, maybe now we're dealing with the lethality of the game, right? 10th edition has a bit of an issue where, you're going to lose a ton of units potentially. And like terrain, I think, helps with that. Simplifying the rules of terrain makes it so that, some things are better. Cover is more codified and it's more resilient, and you're able to, maybe get it easier, maybe not get it as easy, but it kind of forces the game state to be, okay, now we have to like focus on gameplay a little bit more. And now it's like, okay, maybe things are a bit too strong. Maybe, a 10-man team of standard infantry should not be able to dump into a 3-man team of elites and pick them up in a single turn. We need to make sure that balance is fitting across the board and it feels like it makes more sense and that sort of thing. So I hope that it's, tweak a few things, mainly keep the breadth of 10th edition, but nothing major. A major rules right, I think, is just going to tank all the new faces that we have, and it's just going to really mess with everything involved. And then lastly, my last thing that I hope they do not do is what they did in Horus Heresy. So in Horus Heresy, one thing they did is they split leadership into 4 specific stats. And while I think that it's a really cool idea, right? So it makes it so that your units that should be good in a specific area, so like keeping their cool or engaging with tech or leading, like those things are strong in a specific unit or leader versus the others, to make it feel like, okay, this unit is really good at messing with machines, so that skill is higher, but they're really bad at keeping their cool, or they're really easily shaken, so that stat is lower. I think that's really cool. I think it's really an interesting idea. But with the scale of 40k, the fact that we're bringing like 10 to 15 units, if not more, having to track all 4 of those stats, figure out what they all do, it just makes it like more granular, and I think it would slow things down in a negative way. Whereas I think that 40k, the pacing of 40k is already tipping towards slow. And I think more people than not would want to see it speed up a bit. So I don't think it needs to add things that will slow it down. Whereas I feel like Horus Heresy, because it's more of a kind of lore-based kind of war game, having that slower gameplay is more conducive to the environment. It makes it feel a bit more grimdark. And for me, Horus Heresy feels darker than 40k. I feel like 40k wants to be grimdark, but it's kind of, the lore definitely is, but the game doesn't really give that feeling of darkness like Horus Heresy kind of does. So my thing is, I really hope that Horus Heresy changing that wasn't an indication that they were thinking about or planning to do it with 40k. So we'll kind of have to wait and see. But yeah, those are, my 7, or I guess my 10 total hopes for 40k 11th edition. If the rumors are true and they keep true to this 3-year cycle, which I honestly think they will, We should be seeing 11th edition in June of 2026. But what are you excited for? Are you excited for anything in particular relating to 40k and kind of what we're seeing in 10th edition? Do you think a lot will change? What do you hope for? Are there any things that you're really pressing for and would really hope to see? Let me know, down in the comments below, and maybe we can have a follow-up discussion next week on it. Otherwise, I think next week is likely going to be maybe a painting session. I'm a little behind on my Storm Surge. So for this month's painting competition, we are doing monsters or Titanic models. And I really wanted to do a Titanic model. And I've been kind of eyeing the Storm Surge for a while. So I am working on my Storm Surge, doing a bit more of a stylized kind of cell shaded look. And I'm admittedly a little further behind than I hoped I would. So I think it'd be kind of a cool thing. Maybe we can just do a bit of a, painting and chill stream next week while I kind of work on that. Maybe show you guys a little bit of how my process when I paint. So I think that'd be a lot of fun. But I hope to see you guys next week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time.